Picture this. It's the middle of August. The temperature outside hits 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Your electricity bill from last month is still sitting on the counter, and the number on it made your stomach drop. You walk over to your air conditioner, put your hand in front of the vent, and feel that cold blast of air. Relief. But also dread. Because you know that machine is running constantly, burning through energy, and costing you more every single hour. Now imagine someone hands you a white powder, a bag you can buy for under $2 at most hardware or garden supply stores. They tell you this powder can lower the temperature in a room, not by blowing cold air, but by pulling heat directly out of the surrounding environment through a chemical reaction. No compressor, no refrigerant, no electric motor. Your first instinct is probably disbelief, and that reaction is completely understandable. But here is what makes this story genuinely fascinating. This is not a new invention. It is not a social media trick designed to waste your time. The science behind this powder is over 200 years old, used by engineers, studied by chemists, and in specific forms, even regulated by governments. The powder we are talking about is calcium chloride, and in certain applications and concentrations, it behaves in ways that most people have never been taught. This video is not going to promise you a magic replacement for your home air conditioning system. What it will do is explain a real scientific phenomenon, where it comes from, why it works, how it is actually used today, and why certain concentrated or industrial forms of it have faced restrictions in specific regions across the United States. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, the way you think about heat, moisture, and cooling will be permanently changed. To understand how calcium chloride ended up in this conversation, you need to travel back to the early 19th century, specifically to the work of chemists who were obsessed with one question: how does nature manage temperature without machines? In ancient Persia, architects built structures called yakshils, massive conical towers that used passive airflow, underground chambers, and a material called sarouge to keep ice frozen in the middle of the desert through summer. These were not accidents of design. They were engineered cooling systems built without a single moving part, based entirely on the physics of evaporation and thermal mass. Persian engineers understood something fundamental. Heat can be moved without electricity, as long as you understand what absorbs it. Fast forward to 1808, when the British chemist Humphrey Davy first isolated calcium metal through electrolysis. The compound calcium chloride had already been known in rudimentary forms, but it was through the expansion of industrial chemistry in the 1800s that scientists began cataloging its unusual thermal behavior. When calcium chloride dissolves in water, it does not simply mix, it releases energy. The process is strongly exothermic, meaning it generates heat. But the far more interesting behavior appears in a different form entirely. Anhydrous calcium chloride, meaning calcium chloride that has had all its water removed, is extraordinarily hygroscopic. It pulls moisture out of the air aggressively. And when certain desiccant compounds related to this family are used in controlled systems designed to manage humidity, they can indirectly affect perceived temperature in ways that early 20th century industrial engineers began to study seriously. By the 1930s and 1940s, desiccant-based cooling systems were being explored as alternatives to vapor compression refrigeration, which was expensive, used toxic refrigerants, and required significant mechanical infrastructure. The concept was real. The science was published. And in parts of the developing world where electricity infrastructure was limited or non-existent, desiccant cooling systems were not a curiosity, they were a practical solution. The story of calcium chloride is ultimately the story of a compound that has been hiding in plain sight for 2 centuries, doing useful work while the world built bigger and louder machines around it. To understand what calcium chloride actually does, and why it can influence temperature, you need to understand 2 separate but connected scientific principles: hygroscopic absorption and evaporative cooling. Start with hygroscopic absorption. Certain compounds have a molecular structure that attracts water molecules from surrounding air with unusual force. Calcium chloride is one of the most powerful naturally occurring desiccants known to chemistry. It does not just absorb surface moisture, it pulls water vapor directly from ambient air, even when humidity levels are relatively low. This is why roads are sometimes pre-treated with calcium chloride in winter. It draws moisture from the atmosphere, which prevents ice from forming on the surface. Now here is where the cooling connection comes in. When liquid water evaporates, it absorbs thermal energy from whatever surface it leaves behind. This is exactly why your skin feels cold after sweating. The evaporating moisture is carrying heat away from your body. In desiccant-based cooling systems, this principle is engineered into a cycle. First, the desiccant absorbs moisture from incoming warm air, dehumidifying it. Then, that moisture is released elsewhere through a regeneration process. The dehumidified air is then passed over a wet surface or through an evaporative pad, where the now dry air encourages rapid evaporation, and that evaporation produces a measurable drop in temperature. In direct desiccant evaporative cooling systems, researchers have documented temperature reductions of 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit under the right conditions, with energy consumption dramatically lower than conventional compressor-based systems. A 2018 study, published in the journal Energy and Buildings, confirmed that desiccant-assisted evaporative cooling can reduce energy consumption by 40 to 70% in low humidity climates, compared to standard air conditioning. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a structural shift in how cooling can be approached. The reason calcium chloride specifically draws attention is because it is cheap, widely available, and performs its desiccant role without requiring rare materials or complex manufacturing. The $2 figure referenced in the title reflects its actual retail price in small quantities at hardware stores, sold as a moisture absorber, driveway treatment, or concrete accelerant. Its cooling application is not sold as a product. It is a principle, waiting to be understood. At this point, a fair question emerges. If desiccant cooling works this well, why is your home still running a refrigerant-based air conditioner that costs hundreds of dollars a month to operate? The honest answer involves efficiency curves, humidity limitations, and the economics of the existing industry. Conventional vapor compression air conditioners, the kind installed in nearly every American home, work by compressing a refrigerant gas, which causes it to shed heat outside and absorb heat inside. They are highly effective across a wide range of humidity conditions and can cool a room from 90 degrees to 68 degrees regardless of whether the outside air is dry or saturated. That versatility is their strength. Desiccant evaporative cooling, by contrast, performs best in dry climates. In places like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, or the inland regions of California, the math works enormously in its favor. But in high humidity regions, Florida, Louisiana, coastal Georgia, the approach becomes significantly less effective because the air is already close to saturated and evaporation slows down. A system that works brilliantly in Phoenix struggles in Miami. This is the balanced reality that separates genuine science communication from hype. Desiccant cooling is not a universal replacement. It is a climate-specific tool that, in the right geography, outperforms conventional cooling on both cost and environmental impact. Now, about the bans. This is where precision matters. Calcium chloride itself is not banned as a substance. It is used in food preservation, road treatment, medicine, and construction. What has faced regulatory restriction in certain states is the large-scale outdoor application of calcium chloride and related chloride-based compounds due to documented environmental effects. In 17 states, including several in the Northeast and Pacific Northwest, specific regulations govern how chloride-based desiccants can be applied to roads, fields, or open environments because of their impact on groundwater salinity, soil composition, and aquatic ecosystems. When calcium chloride washes into streams or permeates soil at high concentrations, it raises salinity in ways that native freshwater species cannot tolerate. Macroinvertebrates, amphibians, and certain fish populations have shown measurable population decline in waterways near heavily treated roads. Environmental agencies in states like Vermont, Minnesota, and Oregon have implemented usage limits, application guidelines, and in some cases outright bans on unregulated outdoor application. The title's reference to bans is grounded in this environmental regulation story, not a suppression of technology, but a documented ecological consequence of overuse. The compound is not dangerous in the quantities used for small-scale moisture control. The problem emerges at industrial or municipal scale, applied across thousands of miles of roadway annually with little containment. Understanding the science is only half the value. The more practical question is, what can an ordinary person actually do with this knowledge? The most accessible application is moisture and temperature management in enclosed spaces. In a garage, workshop, basement, or storage room, calcium chloride desiccant packs, the same ones sold commercially under various brand names, absorb excess humidity from the air. Lower humidity means the air feels cooler at the same temperature, because humidity interferes with your body's natural evaporative cooling system. At 80 degrees with 30% humidity, you feel significantly cooler than at 80 degrees with 80% humidity. Removing moisture from the air does not lower the thermometer reading, but it dramatically changes how hot the space feels to a human body. For those living in dry climates, a more ambitious application exists in the form of DIY evaporative coolers, sometimes called swamp coolers, which are already commercially sold and widely used in the American Southwest. Adding a desiccant pre-treatment stage to a swamp cooler setup, where incoming air passes through a desiccant material before hitting the evaporative pad, increases the cooling efficiency measurably. This is the exact principle being studied in academic and engineering circles for next-generation, low-energy cooling systems. On a community or building scale, architects in countries like India, Australia, and parts of the Middle East are incorporating desiccant wheel systems into commercial HVAC designs. These systems use a rotating wheel coated in desiccant material to continuously dehumidify incoming air, regenerate the desiccant using low-grade waste heat, and then direct the dry air through an evaporative cooling stage. Buildings using this approach have reported operating costs significantly below comparable conventional systems, with carbon footprints reduced by nearly half in pilot installations. For the everyday viewer, the most honest and immediately useful takeaway is this: controlling humidity in your living space is one of the most cost-effective ways to reduce your dependence on air conditioning. A $2 bag of desiccant crystals placed in a small room will not replace your AC unit. But understanding the science behind it and applying it thoughtfully can reduce how often your AC needs to run, lower your electricity bill, and make your space feel more comfortable without a single new machine. There is something quietly remarkable about a compound that costs less than a cup of coffee, has been studied for over 2 centuries, and still holds lessons that most people have never encountered. Calcium chloride is not a miracle. It is not suppressed technology. It is a well-documented chemical with a specific set of properties that, when understood properly, can be applied in genuinely useful ways. The story of desiccant cooling is ultimately a story about the gap between what science knows and what everyday people are taught. Enormous energy resources are spent every summer running compressor-based air conditioning systems in climates where alternatives exist, quieter, cheaper, less damaging to the environment. The bans are real, and they are justified, not as suppression of knowledge, but as protection of ecosystems that cannot defend themselves against chloride contamination. That nuance matters. A compound can be useful and also require careful management. Both things are true at the same time. What this video hopefully gave you is something more valuable than a trick. It gave you a mental model. Heat is not just a feeling, it is a measurable quantity that moves through predictable physical and chemical processes. When you understand those processes, you stop being passive in the face of a hot summer and start seeing options that were always there, written into the basic rules of physics and chemistry. If you are the kind of person who enjoys discovering knowledge that most people walk past without noticing, there is a great deal more of it on this channel. Every video is built around the same principle. The world is more interesting when you understand how it actually works. If that sounds like something worth returning to, consider subscribing. New videos are released every week, and the next one might change something else you thought you already understood.